Well, joining us now in Halifax is the Saskatchewan Premier, Scott Moe. Premier, thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you so much, Michael.
So a big agenda today. You're talking about housing, affordability, health care, but without a doubt, the closing news conference seemed to be very dominated by the carbon tax. What exactly was being said about that behind closed doors?
The discussion wasn't so much about the policy and whether, various jurisdictions across Canada felt it was the right policy or the wrong policy or an effective policy for that matter. But it was about the most recent decision by the federal government to exempt home heating fuel and how that was, inherently unfair to Canadian families that may use a different heating source, may have invested already in a different heating source, or may not have any other choice outside of, in Saskatchewan's case, we have about 15% of our population that uses electric or propane, which will not be impacted by this decision. And so the inherent unfairness of the federal government's decision to Canadian families was really the focus of the discussion today.
You use the word unfairness, but of course you've heard it from Justin Trudeau himself. He argues the government program here is meant to be a targeted program. Doesn't Ottawa have the right to bring about a targeted program from time to time, if not legal, at least precedent?
Well, he said that home heating fuel is a dirty way to heat your home. Well, by that, and so his solution to that is to pause the carbon tax and invest in heat pumps in the transitionary mechanism. By that same metric, he should pause the carbon tax on natural gas and coal-fired electricity and invest in the transitionary sources of electrical generation in a place like Saskatchewan. And so it just doesn't add up. And by excluding other Canadians that may be on equally expensive heating sources like electricity, like propane, it just is inherently unfair to Canadians. And I think the premiers unanimously felt that was the case. We most certainly have felt that's the case in Saskatchewan, and we've indicated that if the federal government doesn't bring some common sense and logic to this conversation and make what we feel is the right decision in treating Canadian families fairly, we'll do what we can to treat Saskatchewan families as fairly by making a similar decision that we may be able to make in Saskatchewan as the federal government has made that predominantly impacts Atlantic Canada.
Okay, well, let's pick up on that point because, of course, you and I have talked about this potential of not collecting the carbon tax come the new year in order to give people in Saskatchewan, as you say, an equal break when it comes to the carbon tax. We heard from Premier Higgs of New Brunswick saying that he, too, is going to ask his legal team to look into a possibility for his province to extend the tax break to others. Are you now looking at some type of joint legal action with other premiers when it comes to the carbon tax?
Well, what we would hope is there's some time here and a vote today that the federal government really revisits this decision. We would hope that the federal government, isn't in the business or intentionally treating Canadian families unfairly. Regardless of what a federal minister might come out and say with respect to how many Liberals are voted in Atlantic Canada versus the Prairie provinces. We would hope that the federal government is, always looking as to how they can treat all Canadian families fairly, regardless of the number of federal MPs they have elected and for which party. So that's the answer to this. We may be able to take some action, very controversial action in Saskatchewan, utilizing our publicly owned Crown utility companies, but that would still not impact all Saskatchewan families. If we took action in the natural gas space, for example, that's about 85% of our families. If we happen to go a step further and take action in our electricity space and impact those that are utilizing electric heat in northern Indigenous or rural communities, that wouldn't still leave those that are utilizing propane as a fuel source paying this inherently unfair carbon tax. And so the right thing to do is for the federal government to revisit this decision, treat all Canadian families, including those in Saskatchewan, fairly.
Mm-hmm. At one point in today's news conference, Premier Smith used Quebec as an example. Now, it had to do with housing, but the point that she was making had to do with provincial consultation. And I'm wondering what you would say to that when it comes to the carbon tax, to housing, to pharmacare, to healthcare. What would you say about the need for provincial consultation? And do you, as Premier of Saskatchewan, need to enact something that would make that necessary, as Quebec has done with housing and negotiating with the province rather than municipalities.
There's broad consideration, and I would say support for looking at, when it comes to housing and expanding our housing opportunities, whether they be in our largest cities like Toronto and Vancouver, for example, that where they do have a challenge with needing additional houses. We have a challenge as well. In other communities, for example, we have underfunded housing in our Indigenous communities, which is primarily a federal responsibility. And so, when it comes to housing in our urban centers and how we're supporting that housing through clean and wastewater infrastructure, through recreational infrastructure, and ensuring that there is recreational facilities there to attract families, the province needs to be at the table. The federal government simply cannot go over or around the province straight to a municipality, for example. We all have a voice and a role in expanding housing in an organized and constructive format. The federal government through funding, the provincial government through the tools that we have, and the municipal governments. And so to exclude one of those would be short-sighted. And there's a real interest from the provinces in ensuring that doesn't happen. And Quebec has already taken a few of those steps, but the provinces are looking at even further steps.
To the issue of the fact that there hasn't been a First Ministers' Conference in a number of years now, what do you think needs to happen there?
Well, I think we do have to get together as First Ministers across this nation to regroup. And it's been a challenging number of years. It's not to say that as First Ministers we haven't had discussions, but an official First Ministers Conference, in-person First Ministers Conference has not occurred since 2018. So it is time for us to regroup and to start talking about strategic infrastructure, not just housing, but how we are supporting that housing in our communities, whether they be Northern Indigenous communities, whether they be growing and vibrant towns and cities in Saskatchewan, or whether they be our largest centers in Canada, like Vancouver and Toronto, that have their challenges as well. Always with an eye to being fair to all Canadians, but I would say also revisiting our strategic national infrastructure, like our corridors that are transporting goods to ports ultimately. And those are conversations that I think are very impactful for the health and wealth of our nation, not just in the next year or two, but for the next number of decades. And so it's time to come together.
Premier Scott Moe, always appreciate the time. Thank you for this.
Thank you so much, Michael.